Well, so tonight we've got a comrade from far off lands. Comrade Kenny Coyle was a Glasgow boy, but he stayed in Hong Kong for a number of years and now stays in Macau, I believe. Okay. So Kenny just published a pamphlet on Asia. So tonight's meeting is termed Marxism and the Asian Experience. I did try to get some pamphlets up for today. I spoke to, I left a message with London, but the organisers texted me back this morning from New York, so he's clearly not in London, so we never get the pamphlets up, but we'll get them up shortly. If you want to kick off, Kenny?
Okay. Well, comrades, thank you very much for the invitation to speak tonight. As Tommy said, the background to this is actually a new pamphlet that is going to be out quite soon from the party called Asia, Imperialism and Resistance, which I was strong-armed into writing by John Foster because it was felt that there was a need to give some background to developments in Asia for a whole number of reasons. And when you see the pamphlet, one thing I'd stress is that the pamphlet itself looks mostly at Southeast and Northeast Asia. It doesn't cover the whole of the Asian continent because that would have taken me about 10 years to finish, and it took me long enough to finish the one that I did. But equally, there are some general lessons, I think, from the pamphlet that hopefully when you do get to see a copy of it, and I hope you'll find it useful and helpful, that can be applied to other parts of Asia. The topic, or the title of tonight's meeting, Marxism and the Asian Experience, could, I think, just as usefully have been called Asia and the Marxist Experience, because what I wanted to try and bring out in the pamphlet and also in tonight's discussion is that the development of Marxism has depended a great deal on an analysis of Asian societies, much more than I think we're often aware of. And at the same time, Marxism as a body of thought guiding activity has been very important in Asia, not simply because it's been applied, but also because it's been adapted and also developed by Asian Marxists, by Asian communists. And I think it's important to emphasise that, because I think, especially in the British left, there is a tremendous condescension towards the history of the communist movement, and particularly towards the Asian communist movement and the struggles that have been undergone by revolutionaries in very many Asian countries. I think if you take, for example, the attitude of some groups on, let's call it the sectarian left, to someone like Ho Chi Minh, a man who led an enormous number of revolutionary struggles, who was a founder member of the French Communist Party as well as the Indochinese, a man who led the Vietnamese people for decades. It's quite common to come across descriptions of him as if he was simply a nationalist. You know, he wasn't. There was no connection with Marxism or socialism. He was a nationalist, a sort of Alex Salmond with a goatee beard and black pyjamas, if you like. Now, that's really not the case. In fact, the Asian communist parties have had an enormous amount of experience in struggles that are both working class and peasant, building support amongst intellectuals and progressive people generally, fighting armed struggles, fighting parliamentary elections and so on. They've had a whole range of experiences which, at the very least, deserve to be analysed critically, but also, I think, sympathetically. And I think that's something which really only the Communist Party, I think, in Britain has had that attitude. I think much of the left in Britain tends to take a rather superior view that their tendency or their groupings are the only ones that have got the truth, and they tend to really underestimate the tremendous struggles and the tremendous development that Asian revolutionaries have made as a contribution to Marxism as a whole. So in that sense I wanted to make that point. So Marxism and the Asian experience is also Asia and the Marxist experience. It's something about the development and the history of Marxism. And one of the things which I didn't really go into in the pamphlet, and I'll say a little bit about it here, is that quite early on, when Marx was developing his own analysis of capitalism, he was looking very much at understanding the origins of capitalism. And as almost an aside, he began to look at the development of Asian societies, specifically India, but also China to an extent. And it clearly intrigued him as to why it was that these societies, which had thousands of years of civilization and which had been incredibly advanced at previous points in history, had failed to develop capitalism, and capitalism had emerged in this rather small part of the world, this northwestern Europe, rather than in a country like China, which had thousands of years of continuous civilization, which had been extremely innovative, had developed all sorts of technological advances, but it had been unable to develop capitalism. So that when the British got to Hong Kong in the 1840s, they were relatively easily able to overwhelm this massive empire with relatively few warships and soldiers and so on, and had been able to do pretty similar things in India and other parts of Asia. So one of the things that Marx had to grapple with was to try and understand why it was that Asia hadn't developed capitalism, and why capitalism had been something that had its genesis in Europe. And I remember many years ago when I joined the YCL, I was given a little pamphlet. It was called Our Philosophy. It was a very simple introduction to Marxism, and in it there was a little cartoon sections. It was quite a well-produced little pamphlet, actually, although the politics were maybe not particularly brilliant. And in it there was this description of what I learned to understand and call the historical materialism, the idea that the human race had moved from primitive communist society to slave society to feudalism to capitalism, and was already beginning to make the first steps into socialism and communism. And that was a very simple introduction to Marxism, and it's one that really built upon in subsequent years in party educations and so on. But of course, Marx didn't just talk about those kinds of societies. He also very famously refers to something called the Asiatic mode of production, which was not really something I'd ever really come across in party educationals or discussions, and something which has been a very controversial topic amongst many Marxists all over the world, not just in Asia. I'm not going to go into the ins and outs of that particular debate, except to say that I think that what Marx was trying to do in discussing historical stages was to answer this question: where did capitalism come from? Why did it come from Europe? And why did it not come from anywhere else? And in this Asiatic mode of production debate, which is extremely complex and very confusing, one of the issues there really is Marx was trying to, in a sense, solve two questions with one answer. The first question was, how did class societies develop in the first place? How did they emerge out of primitive communism? And secondly, why hadn't China or India developed along the lines of the feudal system that had been dominant in Western Europe? And I think Marx was grappling with these two different questions, and he kind of put them together in one answer. And I think, therefore, that the Asiatic mode of production is a very confusing and very, at the same time, very fruitful area of discussion. A lot of Marxists have found extremely interesting pathways out of it, but it's become, we'll talk a little bit later about it, it became very tied to some of the disputes within the communist movement in the 1930s, and you'll often find comrades from, certainly from various Trotskyist organisations, raising this as an example of Stalinist dogmatism, that the Asiatic mode of production is not included as a mainstream idea within Marxism. But I think that, as I said, what Marx was trying to get to was this fundamental question: why did Asian societies, in fact non-European societies, develop in a different way? Why didn't they create capitalism in the way that European societies had? So I think to begin with then we can say that Marx was very aware of the differences, the divergence between Asian and European societies, even if he didn't exactly come to a completely exact and correct answer to it. He nonetheless recognised that there was a fundamental difference in the way in which these countries, these societies had developed, and that was a first attempt really to do that. It's quite interesting that today we're thinking of countries like China, and to a certain extent India, Indonesia, and so on, as being almost the most vibrant elements of the world economy. And yet the fact is that for 100 years or so, most Marxists looked at India, China, and so on as being the most backward possible forms of society. So there are questions here, I think, about how that has changed and to what extent it has changed. I think it's important to bring that to the fore, because there's been a tendency to adopt, I would say, some very simplistic answers to the rise of China, for example. There's a book written a couple of years ago called When China Rules the World, which is a prediction that within a decade or so, the world economy and cultural diplomacy, everything is going to be pretty much determined by what this Chinese state does, this state led by a communist party, a state committed to Marxism, Leninism, committed to the building of socialism and communism. And the author of this book, who predicts this tremendous change, is a guy called Martin Jakes, who 20, 30 years ago was arguing that, well, socialism was obsolete, Marxism obsolete, class struggle finished, and well, the idea that you would actually have a socialist society, or a socialist state, I should say, which is already the world's second largest economy, and probably by 2018, 2019 will become the world's largest economy. That is a fundamental shift. And I think that's something which many Marxists have got to come to grips with, why this economic shift has happened. And it's not an easy or simple answer. It's not because imperialism has ceased to exist. If anything, if we look at the recent events in Libya, where you see that China was relatively powerless to do anything, it was opposed to the war and the attack on Libya, but it was really unable to do anything much except make a very weak, muted protest about the attacks there. We still see that Western imperialism still calls the shots. It's still in the West where you have the major centres of financial power and military power. That hasn't yet changed. But the rise of what we used to call developing countries, but increasingly becoming developed or medium developed countries, is something which is a change in the balance of forces worldwide that we really have to take on board in a way which I think we haven't done amongst the British left. We, especially in the communist movement, were very fixated on the massive shift in the balance of forces after 1989, 1991. In fact, I mean, almost exactly 20 years ago, if we'd been meeting here, we'd be discussing the collapse of the coup against Gorbachev, the Yeltsin move to ban the Soviet Communist Party, and so on. This was a time when everybody was saying it's the end of history, it's the victory of the West, the triumph of capitalism, and so on. And yet, if you were to watch, or as I've been watching the past few months, if you watch the BBC, endless documentaries and news items about the decline of the West, about how India is going to take over, the Silicon Valley and California is finished and it's all going to shift towards India. China is now the real heartland of manufacturing and so on. And this has happened within 20 years, is that there has definitely been a shift in the balance of forces. It's not simply between capitalism and socialism as we used to imagine it, but there's certainly some realignment going on. that we certainly have to take on board in terms of our analysis of what's happening. So we have to perhaps reassess some of the questions that we think, or we had thought had been answered by Marx or Lenin or whoever in the past about the developments of Asian societies. Certainly, some of Marx's ideas about India in particular really were quite wrong. I mean, he adapted or adopted views which were seeing India as being a very stagnant society and so on. And that reflected a lot of the prejudices of the time. It reflected a certain colonial attitude towards the Asian peoples, that they weren't particularly inventive, they weren't particularly innovative, they weren't particularly hard-working, etc., etc. All these kind of racial elements existed. And inevitably, Marx, who never visited Asia, and Engels, who never visited Asia, inevitably the material that they had to hand, the raw material, the data that they had to hand, had all these biases built in. And in some cases they were able to see through it and to correct it, and Marx was very strong in his support for the Indian people's struggle for independence, and he also began to understand the importance of the struggle in China against Western domination. But at the same time, he had initially imagined that capitalism was going to be something which would be revolutionary in terms of Asia. It was going to be something that was going to develop and modernise Asian societies. And he relatively quickly began to see that, in fact, the domination of Asia by Western countries was something which was doing the opposite. It was actually deindustrialising and undermining the potential of these countries to develop their own industry. There's many examples from India, especially in the textile industry, that can be given here. So he began quickly to understand that his initial views were wrong, and he began to see the development of capitalism as something that was underdeveloping, disdeveloping is not a word, destroying the possibility of industrial development. I think that's very important because, in a sense, it was predating Lenin's analysis, which came 5 or 6 decades later, about the nature of imperialism. Already Marx was beginning to understand that capitalism on a global scale wasn't something that was inevitably progressive against the old order. It had also very reactionary elements as well. It was something which was very destructive of people's living standards and so on. So in terms of Marx's initial foray, if you like, into analysing Asian societies, there are some incredibly important insights that Marx made, even though he got substantial things wrong, and that's perhaps understandable given, as I said, given the materials that he had to hand at the time. Nonetheless, he did really begin to understand some fundamental issues. One, that Asia had developed, or Asian societies had developed, in a way which didn't fit exactly the model that he had seen developing in Europe, and that was an important thing to recognise. Secondly, that the domination of the Western capitalist powers over the Asian countries was something that was not designed to allow them to develop. So he saw it as a very reactionary process. And also that he saw amongst the oppressed peoples of Asia, he saw that their resistance, their struggles, was something that could be and should be supported, that they weren't simply developments which were against progress, which was, of course, the stand taken by the colonial powers. And I was very interested to read, there's a collection here of some discussions held in the Socialist International, the Second International, in the early 1900s at, I think it was the Stuttgart Conference, where there's a group of socialists from Germany and France and so on discussing the colonial question. And a number of them are saying, well, colonialism is a positive thing. We're bringing capitalism, we're bringing industry to these poor backward people in Africa and Asia. This is a positive thing. We should be supporting it. And it's very frighteningly similar to some of the arguments that we've heard over the past decade or so from people within New Labour, especially, about the new imperialism, the humanitarian imperialism that we now have, where we intervene to help these countries for their own benefit. We impose sanctions on the regimes, we take their money, but we'll give it back to them, provided, of course, that they use it, spend it wisely and properly. We'll bring them all sorts of benefits of Western technology and access to things like NATO and the European Union and all these things that they really want and they really need. And 100 years ago, similar arguments were being put, I mean, in a far more obviously racist way, I would say, but fundamentally the arguments are quite similar. So there has always been this tendency, this kind of opportunist tendency to look at imperialism in a very positive way, and something which the Marxist left really continues to have to struggle against. As I mentioned, this battle against the right wing in the socialist movement, the early 1900s, clearly this is where we can bring in the figure of Lenin, who, in his analysis of the world economy, was developing the theory of imperialism. And aligned to the theory of imperialism was the idea that imperialism creates conditions and ideas amongst the working class movement and among the socialist movement, which he called opportunism. We might use other terms like reformism and revisionism in certain areas. But what he was clear about was that the struggle against imperialism was not just one of economic struggle. He emphasised that the struggle against imperialism was a democratic struggle, because imperialism took away the rights, the right of nations to self-determination, the right of nations to develop their own economic base, the right of nations to choose their own path. This was a political struggle for Lenin every bit as much as it was an economic one. And it was very important, he argued, to recognise that you can't just transplant, if you like, a kind of trade union consciousness to the struggles of people in other countries. That it wasn't simply a class question. We always come across this from some sections of the sectarian left who want to present struggles in other countries purely as, we must support the workers here, or we can only support the socialists here. Lenin was quite adamant that certain nations and certain peoples were being oppressed. It wasn't simply a question of the exploitation of workers and peasants. Entire nations were being deprived of their rights and their freedoms. And that this kind of anti-imperialist struggle was a necessary ally of the revolutionary movements in the capitalist countries themselves. And further on from that, I think, we could also see that Lenin was very, very astute in recognising that the class structures in especially the Asian countries, if we focus on them, was also very different from the class structure that existed in the more advanced capitalist countries. For one thing, you had a very large peasant population. Now, Lenin knew something about peasant struggle because Russia also had been largely peasant, so he was able to take some of the lessons from the Russian Revolution and to expand them into other areas. But he also recognised that there was much more need for alliance with what we might call the intermediate strata, all those kind of elements that don't really neatly fit into the working class or the peasantry or the capitalist class. And in many developing countries, many Asian countries, these different forces exist fairly numerous in cities and villages, and there needed to be a way of aligning the working class struggle with these forces. Lenin was very determined that any revolutionary struggle had to be a revolution of the majority. He wasn't interested in simply supporting working class struggles in areas where the working class barely existed, except where the working class could make an alliance with the majority of the population, which was almost certainly always the peasantry. And there's a very interesting discussion that Lenin had in the 1920s when a group of Mongolian revolutionaries came to him and visited him in Moscow. and we're talking about the setting up of the Revolutionary Party, and we're saying, Comrade Lenin, we're thinking of setting up a Communist Party, and he said, no, don't do that. You can't do that because you haven't got a working class in Mongolia. You've got herdsmen. Half your population are nomads. How can you have a Communist Party if it's going to be based on these forces? What you need to do is create a revolutionary party, of course, but it needs to be a much broader party. It can't just be a communist party as you would build in France or Germany or Britain. It needs to be a different kind of party. And these kind of lessons, Lenin was very, very astute, I think, in seeing the substantial differences that existed between the kinds of struggle in Asian countries and in most of the European ones. He was also, I think, very astute in recognising that the role of and this is quite a controversial one, so I dealt with it at some length in the pamphlet, but I'll make a couple of quick points on it. He was very adamant that communists should not assume that the role of the bourgeoisie, the capitalists in the Asian countries, was exactly the same as it was in the European countries. In Europe, the capitalist class en masse had already fulfilled its revolutionary potential, or exhausted its revolutionary potential. But he argued that that wasn't necessarily the case in countries like India or China, where there was a very different setup, where the dominance of imperialism meant that local capitalists often found themselves as second-class citizens, just the same as the workers and peasants did. And many, many examples of that, I think, from history. But he was quite clear that there needed to be a completely different set of tactics involved in bringing together revolutionary alliances in Asian countries from the European ones. And one of the big differences was the fact that he argued that the local capitalist classes were actually quite divided. There were really two trends within the capitalist classes within each country. One section would be inevitably tied to the foreign imperialist power. Usually this section is called the comprador bourgeoisie. These are middlemen for the big imperialist companies, and they collaborated quite effectively and quite enthusiastically in some cases with the British or the French or whoever. They adopted the styles and the dress of their colonial masters. They maybe even sent their sons to schools in Harrow and Eton and what have you. So this comprador bourgeoisie was really working hand in glove with the foreign imperialists. But Lenin was insistent that there was also, because they were second-class citizens, there was also the potential for some sections of the capitalist class in these countries to resist imperialism, and in some cases to play a very revolutionary role. And a particular revolutionary role that he held up was the example of China, where Sun Yat-sen, who had been a leading revolutionary in the revolution of 1911, before Mao and the communists had even come together, Sun Yat-sen was seen as somebody who was actually still a revolutionary nationalist, but not a socialist, although he talked in some vague ways about socialism. But he was an anti-imperialist. He was prepared to fight a revolutionary struggle. He organised a nationalist party. He helped organise nationalist armies to fight for the unification of China, to expel the foreign imperialists and to unify the country and to get rid of the backwardness of feudalism and so on in China. And Sun Yat-sen was held up really by Lenin as one of the best examples of these bourgeois nationalists, bourgeois democrats in Asia, people who could be won as allies, maybe not forever and a day, but they could be won for a substantial amount of time in the struggle against imperialism and against backwardness, and that the communists should enter into alliances with them. And the question of how those alliances could actually work well, that's up to parties themselves to try and work out the tactics. And some Asian parties did extremely well, others did extremely badly. But the general point about finding ways of working with them is a very controversial one. Some people, inevitably in a country like Britain, where we've grown up in a very advanced capitalist society, we don't see much in the way of a progressive bourgeoisie of any kind, I think it's fair to say. Yet at the same time, Lenin recognised that the bourgeoisie in some of the Asian countries had not exhausted the revolutionary potential. They still had some ability to resist, and that was important. Communists had to find some means of working with those forces. And there's some very interesting differences in how communists in the Asian countries approached that question. In Vietnam, for example, the Vietnamese working class came into being because of the French. There was no capitalism, there was no Vietnamese capitalism until the French came. The French came, they built their ports and their railways, they employed local Vietnamese, they formed a working class out of that. And in Vietnam, the working class actually predates the Vietnamese capitalist class. And that was one of the reasons why, in the history of the Vietnamese revolutionary movement, the Communist Party was pretty much always the dominant force. There were other nationalist groups, but they were always subordinate to the Communists. The Communists were the dominant force because they were the ones who'd organised the railway workers, who'd organised the port workers, and in turn had won over teachers and professional people. They'd organised peasant unions and so on. And they stole the march, really, on the Vietnamese capitalists. So the Vietnamese capitalist class had no option but either to follow the communists or find some ways of collaborating with them, but on the communists' terms, or they had to collaborate with imperialism. The situation in China was very different because there you had someone like Sun Yat-sen, you had a massive nationalist movement, the Kuomintang. Well, Sun Yat-sen was alive, the communists were able to work within the Kuomintang. Mao was a trade union organiser at one point, he was then a peasant organiser for the Kuomintang. Zhou Enlai was a military advisor. Some of the great leaders of the Chinese Communist Party all played roles within this nationalist movement while Sun Yat-sen was alive. A comparison might be, and it's a simplistic one, but the comparison would be the situation in South Africa, where you have a South African Communist Party, you have the ANC, you have the trade unions, all of which are separate organisations, but where you can be a communist, trade unionist and an ANC member all at the same time. Something similar was possible in China for that period of time, until 1927, when a section of the Kuomintang leadership turned against the communists and slaughtered them, and was, for the next 10 years, hell-bent on trying to destroy the Chinese Communist Party, and they failed. And in 1937, when the Japanese invaded, the communists and the Kuomintang formed a second alliance, this time against the Japanese. And if you read Mao in the pamphlet, and I'm sorry we don't have it here tonight, because it stopped me from having to refer to it and quote from it, but if in the pamphlet I give a section from Mao where he talks about the flexibility that was needed by the Chinese Communist Party. 1 minute you're working together, the next minute they're being hunted underground, and then again, in another moment, they're trying to reach out to them to try and form an alliance, an effective alliance against the Japanese. And this kind of flexible tactics of applying a united front in these conditions was extremely, extremely difficult. And the Chinese had to undergo any number of changes, very different from the Vietnamese. It's quite interesting to compare those two parties. Both were ultimately successful, but they had very, very different conditions. In a country like India, the situation was even more difficult because the nationalist movement there, the Congress Party, Gandhi, and so on, very powerful mass movement. The communists constantly had difficulties in connecting the national issue and the class struggle in a way that was able to win over the best elements within the nationalist movement, particularly complicated in the period of the Second World War, when the communists, I think correctly, in India were arguing for an anti-fascist war with an anti-imperialist element to it, but they were in a condition of still being held as part of the British Empire, whereas for the Chinese communists it was an entirely different matter. To talk about an alliance with the United States or Britain was a very different matter for them. In India, the situation for the Indian communists was much more complicated, very, very complicated. The situation in Burma, just next door, was almost in between. At one stage, the nationalist leaders were collaborating with the Japanese, seeing that as being the way forward. And then they flipped over. Aung San Suu Kyi, the leader of the National League for Democracy in Burma, Nobel Peace Prize winner, her father had been one of the founder members of the Communist Party in Burma at one stage. He then went over to a position of collaboration with the Japanese, realised that was a horrendous position, flipped back over, made an alliance again with the British and with the Burmese communists, and then from that moment on there was a different kind of united front in Burma. Something very, very interesting in between the kind of Indian experience and the Chinese experience. So you have an enormous range of situations where communists had to really think on their feet very quickly, with constantly shifting balance of forces, being affected both by the domestic situation and by the international situation, which was changing in a way that they couldn't control, but they had to react to. I'll leave that part of it there because, as I said, within the pamphlet I'll go into a little bit more detail about this, but it's still a very complex issue. And one of the things that comes out of it, I think, is a contemporary question, which is the national bourgeoisie was seen as I said, that section of the capitalist class in these countries that resisted imperialism. Now that was that was controversial enough at a time when many of these countries were colonies or when they were dominated by imperialism. But after 1945, when there was a gradual ending of colonial rule, the question, and I think it's still a live question, is there still such a thing as a national bourgeoisie? Because in some countries in Asia it's quite clear that the nationalist forces became almost corrupted. They created their own kind of capitalism. In some countries, like Indonesia or so on, or the Philippines, people who might have been put in the category of the national bourgeoisie in the 1930s, by the 1960s were the ones who were pushing for greater links and greater collaboration with imperialism in a different context. And I think this is quite an interesting point about what's going on in countries like Thailand and Malaysia and so on today. It's an issue I know that is a big question for communists in South Asia, where you do have the beginnings of a development of large-scale industrial groups led by local capitalists like Tata in India, for example. It's a very big conglomerate there. To what extent do these forces still have an interest in resisting imperialism? There's, I think, an enormous number of issues there, and I'm not going to attempt to give one answer to it. It depends, I think, on each individual country. But it's worth bearing in mind, because occasionally you see some extremely unexpected political developments in some of the Asian countries. For example, in the 1990s, when the Asian economic crisis hit Southeast Asia particularly badly, it hit Thailand first and it hit Malaysia very badly. The Malaysian government responded, and the Malaysian government is a fairly conservative, right-wing, religious, nationalist group. But the Malaysian government responded by immediately changing the rules on foreign currency transactions and put all sorts of controls on the economy to stop the currency speculation that was destroying and pulling these countries apart. And Malaysia was actually one of the first countries to recover from the 1997 crisis as a result of that. And the leader of Malaysia at the time, a guy called Dr. Mahathir, was apparently, and this is someone who was a a long-time anti-communist, by no means a socialist, would apparently turn up at cabinet meetings reading out speeches by Fidel Castro on the iniquities of the global financial imperialist order. And in fact, Malaysia at that point began to develop quite close and very friendly relations with Cuba as a result of that. So these kind of rather strange divergences from what you might expect, these things are still happening, I think, in Asia. There's still an enormous amount of debate, I think, that we need to have about whether these concepts that were applied initially in the 1920s and 1930s, in which communists actually were able to extend and develop, do they still have some relevance today, or are they obsolete? Is there some way we can look at countries and sections of the capitalist class in these countries? Are they potential allies? Are they capable of being won over in a slightly different way? Or should the working class and the progressive movement in these countries see them very much as enemies and form different sets of alliances? That's, I think, a question which I'll leave open, except to say that in the pamphlet, I think you'll see I've brought in some discussions from, for example, the Philippines, where historically there was quite a sharp division within the Communist Party and within the left there, and the Communist Party, if you like, the mainstream Communist Party, the other one went towards a more Maoist position. But the mainstream Communist Party has always argued for the development of what they call a nationalist agenda, where they would try to support the development of the national economy rather than simply have the Philippines dominated by American and Korean and other multinationals. Now, whether that's possible or not, it's not really for me to judge, but I think that's a kind of practical question which communists in these countries have to deal with on a daily basis. It's not very different in a sense from the kind of questions that we've had to deal with in Britain about deindustrialisation, the attacks on industry, the debates not so long ago about some of the strikes that were happening and the disputes where sometimes slogans were raised, British jobs for British workers. There's all sorts of very interesting contradictions at work there. And we need to be more and more aware of how these things will be played out in Asia, because I think the Asian countries are clearly going to become more and more important in terms of the world economy. I haven't spoken very much, because I think I've probably gone over time anyway, but I haven't spoken very much about what is a very fundamental point about the Asian experience today, which is that in Asia we find, of the 5 remaining socialist countries that are outlined in the Britain's Road to Socialism, of the 5 remaining countries, 4 of them are in Asia. Only Cuba is anywhere else. China, Vietnam, Laos and North Korea are still considered by the CPB to be part of the world. And yet the divergence between what the North Koreans are doing, the Chinese and the Vietnamese, is very, very substantial. I'm not going to go into that here, because I think that can be up for discussion. And I've spoken several times about China here in the past, so I'm not going to rehearse all those arguments again. But it raises a second set of questions, which is the socialist experience in Asia, the experience of socialist construction. In the past, we didn't need to take it too seriously, because we could look at the GDR, we could look at Czechoslovakia, we could look at industrialised socialist countries, and we could draw some kind of lessons from them, positive or negative, but at least there were societies that were very similar, or seemed very similar to our own. And I visited the GDR twice, I visited Czechoslovakia, and you could see relatively similar standard of living, and you could see a culture there that was quite European. So there were certainly some arguments for learning a lot from these countries. Asia has always seemed so different and so alien to the European experience that we probably have paid very little attention to it. And people probably still have an image of China as everybody in mouse suits and caps, all walking along or riding bikes between the factories, and that's not what's happening in China now. Shanghai, Beijing, many parts of southern China are very advanced, industrialised centres, more advanced than some parts of this city, for example, in terms of the infrastructure that they've got and the investment they've got. We might need to reassess that kind of understanding. We might need to start learning again from the Asian socialist experience, not in an uncritical way, and we've had this discussion before, and I think the last time I spoke was very much on what direction China is going to take. But I think we have to take the view that we have to learn from the Asian experience, and Marxism, from the very beginning, as I tried to show, has been something which has always been a work in progress, something which has tried to absorb and to analyse developments in every part of the world. And Asia has been at the heart, I think, of much of the development of what we call Marxism, and certainly what we call Leninism, has really been part of that extension, analysing the impact of Asia on revolutionary movements worldwide. And I think that's where I'll kind of stop and try and bring those kind of points to a close, but just to say that I think that it's a very wide topic, and anybody who has visited any Asian country knows just how radically different one is from the other. And I was very reluctant to write the pamphlet. It was only because John pretty much forced me to, because it meant bringing together such diverse experiences and cultures and languages and so on. But at the very least, I hope what it does is to reassert the importance of learning from the revolutionary experiences of other countries, and being a little bit humble, I think, in also understanding the quite incredible struggles that communists in other countries had to undergo to achieve their victories. And also, in certain cases, we also have to learn where the defeats were suffered. And some of the defeats were absolutely cataclysmic in Indonesia, Malaysia to an extent as well. We have to learn from all of these very, very diverse experiences to try to bring them together. So I'll leave it there. And as I said, sorry about the fact that we don't have the pamphlet here yet. But I'll come back and do another meeting when you finally get one from London.
Thanks, Kenny. Well, that was very helpful. Certainly look forward to reading the pamphlet, Kenny.